Setting up your Flask Endpoint controller. In this module, we're going to set up a controller to interact with our data store that we just created. And in this module, I'll show you how to handle incoming calls to the API, perform work with the data, and then return it. We're going to set up a data store for the API, create a model for our data, and then create methods to insert and retrieve that data. So let's get started. Okay, so now I'm SSH'd into the server. Now first, we need to add CORS support to our application. This allows cross-origin requests so we can make requests from one site to another in case you want to host your site elsewhere. To do that, we type in sudo pip install -u flask-cors. Now let's create a file called api.py. Now in this file, we want to put the following at the top. As you can see here, we import Flask and a few modules from it. We import some other modules that we'll need for the application, and then we set up logging. All logging will be done to a file called api.log. At this time, I have the level set to debug, which means it'll log a lot of entries, especially when something breaks. If you want to push this into production, you'll want to turn that off. And then we create an instance of Flask, so we're ready to go. Now the first method we're going to put in is for handling 404s. Basically, any request that doesn't fit the methods we have will go in here. And so we create a simple error handler for the 404, and we make it send a response of error not found and then send the 404 code. App error handler is a sort of a listener, something that's triggered when there's an error. We pass in the error code, and in this case it's 404, so app error handler is triggered whenever we get a 404. Then we define the method to be run by the error handler, which in this case is named not found. You can name it whatever you want as long as it makes sense to you. And then next we create a response by making an object that says error and setting it to not found. Then we use JSONify to make it into JSON. We attach 404 to the response so it sends out that error code, and then we return that make response, which sends a 404 to our browser with some information. And now we're going to create the getReadings method. This method does exactly what it says. It gets readings. This is the method used to return multiple readings, so let's explore how that happens in the code. If we follow the order of operations, we have a decorator that adds a route. We talked about routes earlier. It specifies that anyone who accesses /weather/API/v1/readings with a GET request will be routed here. Next, the getReadings method is defined with no parameters. Next, we use the getReading method of data store. We pass in the digit 30 for 30 records to return, if we have them. This result will be sent with the body of the response so we can wrap it with an str method to make sure it's always a string. We have a comma after that and a number 200, which is the HTTP code for success. This is returned with the makeResponse method as we did before. It should return a JSON object with several records in it. However, we may have specified less. If you send a number that's bigger than the amount of records in your database, it'll send whatever amount it has. If you only have 5 records, it'll send 5 records. If you have 30, it will send 30. And now we're going to create a getReading function. As the name implies, we'll use this method to get a single reading. You pass in a reading ID to choose which ID you want to read. This also responds to a get method. However, you must add the ID to the end of the URL in order for this to work. So if you send a request to the URL with no ID, it will send multiple records. If you send an ID at the end, you'll only get the record with that ID. So let's add that in. And as you can see, this should start to look familiar for now. We have a route defined, we have the method defined, and we have a getReading with a reading ID, and then we return the makeResponse just as we have with other ones. The route defined here contains an ID, and we're still asking this method to act on a GET request. Then we contact the data store getSingleReading method and pass it in an ID. This should return a result which will then convert into a string. We send a 200 again so a success message is shown. We then make a response out of this data and return it. It should return a JSON object with a single record in it. Next, we'll make the createReading method. This method is the busiest of all of them. It's the method that will insert a new record. So let's go ahead and put that code in. Now we define our route like we did previously using the same URL structure, but now we're passing a post into that route. Then we create a variable to store the output from request getJSON. This gets the JSON body that's sent with the post. It can be anything, but we want to structure that post so it'll match up to our reading object that we created earlier. Our reading object has an ID and timestamp with it by default, but both of these are created after the record is inserted. So for now, we're going to set those both to none, and the database will take care of those values for us. Next, we create an object called OurReading that's an instance of the reading object, and we pass the request JSON data into this object. If all goes well, the JSON values should map directly to the values in the object, and then we can use it in our application. Next, we make a call to datastore.insertReading, and we send our reading to it. Our reading is a reading object. We then create an insert result, which is a Boolean value that captures the result data store. If something went wrong with the insert, it will be false and we'll need to report that. If it inserted it properly, we'll return true. And then finally we have the switch that checks insert result. If it's true, we'll send out a 200 with the status of succeeded. If it's false, we'll send back a 400 in a failed status. And now we'll send the final method. This just says if the internal name is main and we want to execute app.run with 0.0.0 as a parameter. This parameter is an IP address to listen to. Since we put all zeros, that tells it to listen to all the IPs on your system and be publicly available. Now our controller is complete. If you'd like to download a copy of this from GitHub, the address is here. And let's save and exit. In this module, we set up a data store for our API. We created a model for our data. We created methods to insert and retrieve data. This serves as the base for our API. In the next module, we'll build a controller to interact with it.